Welcome to the 30-day novel NaNoWriMo series. Today is day 29. My name is Lynn Johnston and I blog at writesmarternotharder.com. Since you're still writing your climax today, I just want to remind you of the things that make a good climax. We talked about them yesterday. Victory is earned with sacrifice. It feels hard won. Your protagonist wins through his or her own efforts. The protagonist behaves honorably, doesn't stoop to the antagonist's level. There are twists and turns that keep the reader guessing. It changes who has the upper hand during the climax. And the stakes are as high as they can be for your protagonist and for the story you're trying to tell. So let's talk about how you're moving the story forward today. We see the final showdown end today. The protagonist and antagonist fight to the finish. The main conflict of your story is resolved one way or the other. Maybe your protagonist wins. Maybe your protagonist loses. Maybe your protagonist experiences a Pyrrhic victory where the losses were so great it doesn't feel like a win. Maybe your protagonist drove the antagonist off and the story is resolved for today, but because it's a series, your protagonist is going to encounter that antagonist again, but it's still a victory for now to drive the antagonist off. This is where the main characters, the protagonist and the antagonist, are just throwing everything at each other. It is the last-ditch effort to win, and we see somebody win today. For your protagonist, is your protagonist going to win, lose, which can include deciding that they didn't want to win after all? Maybe the moment in your climax that really shows your protagonist's character growth is where they realize, you know what, my ego has been wrapped up in winning this competition, and that's not what's important in life. What's more important in life is friends. That can be part of how your showdown resolves. The protagonist actually walking away from their original story goal and embracing values or embracing a different goal. Your protagonist can win a Pyrrhic victory, which means that so much was lost that the victory wasn't worth it. They'll have a lot of regrets, or they might be mourning people that they lost in the course of pursuing their goal. In most commercial fiction, readers want the protagonist to win. They want them to achieve the story goal or something better. They want to see the antagonist get defeated. They want to see the protagonist deserve to win. So if you're writing literary fiction, you're not necessarily bound by that. If you're writing a series where the protagonist might have to pick themselves up again and try again later, maybe it's a qualified win or a lose that's not so bad, or a Pyrrhic victory that spurs the protagonist on to do better in the next book. So however you want to end it, whatever kind of a story you're writing and whether or not it's part of a series is going to determine what kind of a story you're writing and how your climax goes. But we need to definitively see something today, even if it's just a victory for now or a loss for now. And I'm kind of stealing that. In romance, they talk about endings either being happy ever after or at least happy for now. So whatever kind of a win or loss you're going to give your protagonist, we want to have it have a certain amount of finality. We want the sense that the big overarching storyline has been resolved, that the main conflict has been resolved, at least for now, that tomorrow the protagonist is not going to wake up with the antagonist standing over them and saying, haha, let's do this again. So you basically want a certain amount of definitiveness, whatever happens to your protagonist, so that the reader feels like, and this is where the story ends. Even if I know this is a series and that there's going to be another story, this one feels like it's over. Looking at your other characters, they really shouldn't be involved in the main action of the final showdown between protagonist and antagonist. They might play a small role or secondary role, just seeing the contagonist is the thing that motivates your protagonist to try a little bit harder during this final showdown because it reminds their protagonist what they're fighting for. But if your other characters play a significant role in the protagonist's win, the reader is going to feel cheated because you're basically saying, oh yeah, you thought all the way through the story that this story was about protagonist. Nope, turns out it's about his best friend. And that's one of the ways that you are not living through or following through on your promises to the reader. If you spend 90% of the story time focused on the protagonist and then another character defeats the antagonist, you basically have pulled a bait and switch on your reader, and you promised them that it was a story where one person is going to have the showdown, and then it turned out to be another person having the showdown with the antagonist. So you want to keep your secondary characters out of the action as much as possible, except again to the extent that they might serve as motivation, or the antagonist might use them to create an obstacle for the protagonist. If your hero's girlfriend is chained to the railroad tracks, she's not affecting the fight he's having with the villain, but she is playing a role in the story, and that she's being used against the protagonist. Looking at the conflict in your story, you want to ask yourself, how is this battle going to be won? How does the winner succeed? How does the loser fail? How does each character's personal strengths and weaknesses play into why they won or why they lost? What final obstacles must the winner overcome in order to achieve victory? And the most of the conflict in today's scenes should be coming from the conflict between protagonist and antagonist. It can be external, i.e. the antagonist is throwing magic grenades at the protagonist, or it can be internal. In other words, they're having a fight about something that is important to both of them. And excuse me, that should be interpersonal. They're having a fight about something that's important to both of them. Or it can be internal conflict, which can be basically the protagonist wrestling with themselves and their weaknesses while they are fighting with the antagonist. Those are the three main sources of conflict that you get in a climax, between where the protagonist is finally having that ultimate battle with the antagonist. Looking at your setting, ask yourself how the protagonist and antagonist are using setting elements to their advantage against each other. And also, what obstacles are there in the setting that they might struggle with? And both of them could be struggling. It doesn't have to just be your protagonist. But of course, you want your protagonist to be struggling as much as your antagonist at this point. There's going to be a moment where your protagonist, if your protagonist is winning, there's going to be a moment where your protagonist seizes the upper hand and defeats the antagonist. And that's going to be a point where your antagonist is struggling more than the protagonist. It might be the very first point in the whole book where your antagonist is struggling more than your protagonist, depending on what kind of story you're writing. But anyway, setting can be used as a source of conflict, as we've talked about throughout the entire series of videos here, and you just want to look at how your setting is going to impact the battle between protagonist and antagonist. And also think about how it can impact that struggle in the most interesting ways. We've all seen rock slides. We've all seen sparks flying out of computer consoles, even though they don't often do that, except in movies. We've all seen rock slides and the cave ceiling collapse. So try and think about how it's going to make, not just how it's going to make things harder, but how it's going to make things harder in a more interesting way. It's like, what is it going to force the protagonist and antagonist to do? Does the protagonist have like an awesomely cool spell that could be used to like melt a wall of frozen water that the antagonist threw at him, or move those rocks? Or does he have a secret ally that he can call on? Did he befriend a rock golem early in the story? Can that guy show up at the end and help him move the rock so he can defeat the antagonist? Like, what would be fun and interesting and cool? And that's something to think about when you're having your protagonist defeat your antagonist. The way your protagonist defeats the antagonist, the more interesting and fun and cool that is for the reader, the better impression, parting impression you're basically leaving on the reader. So think about that. And of course, we don't want to sacrifice character growth and story for the cool stuff, but this is a place where you want to make sure if you only have one cool thing, put it in your climax, because the way that people remember stories, they remember the ending most of all, they remember the beginning second, and then they remember the middle last in terms of like the impact it makes on them. So you want the ending of your book to be something that makes the reader say, wow, that was awesome. And of course, presumably all along, the reader's been bonding with the characters and cares about them. So it's not like the middle part of the book isn't fun and cool. I'm just saying, if there's any place in the story that you want to make sure you put in something that's going to make the reader say, wow, that was awesome, this is it, day 29, put it in here. So looking at your story promise, once you've written your pages for today and your antagonist is defeated, I recommend that you look at that scene that you've written or a series of scenes and ask yourself, did you give the reader a satisfying final showdown that left no stone unturned and pushed everyone involved to their limits? That's what you want your climax to be. You want to see the protagonist being pushed beyond his limits, having basically had to step over the line and just put out an incredibly heroic effort in order to defeat the antagonist. Getting started, please always do your pre-writing ritual and your warm-up exercise. Reread what you wrote yesterday. Also, I just want to say, this is it. This thing that you are writing today is the payoff. It is what your readers have stuck with you for hundreds of pages to get to. So ask yourself, what can I do to make the protagonist's victory or loss be as satisfying as it could possibly be? And maybe you've already done that. Maybe you have put everything you possibly think of into this climax to make it more exciting. You've raised the stakes as high as they can go. You've shown the protagonist suffering as much as they can possibly suffer. You've shown the protagonist just being worn down and past their limits and just somehow reaching deep into their soul and finding what it takes to get over the finish line. Maybe you've done that. If you haven't, if you look at what you've written and you say, this is not as awesome as it seemed in my head, make a note, because when you go back and revise, you want to think about from the beginning of your story how you can add things into the story all the way that will build this climax up and make it more satisfying. So it's not something you need to fix today. Just write out the bare bones, get the action down, get whatever emotion you can get onto the page, do your best, but realize that also probably when you go back and revise, this is something you want to think about. This payoff scene is the reward for the reader to having made it all the way through your book, and it needs to be as awesome as you can make it, and your whole story needs to build up to it. So realize that when you go back and revise and start making changes, all of your changes should be with an eye towards making this climax pay off more emotionally for the reader. After you write, always celebrate your progress and prepare for tomorrow. The resolution is in some ways the easiest and in some ways the hardest scene to write. And you've been writing straight through for 29 days. You've been writing your heart out. So please take a little extra good care of yourself tonight. Get to bed early if you can. Eat a good dinner. Maybe get stuff ready so you can eat a good breakfast. And tomorrow you're going to be writing the very last day of your novel. I'm looking forward to it. I hope you're looking forward to it too. And congratulations on having made it so far. Thanks for hanging out with me, and I hope to talk with you tomorrow to write the very last part of your 30-day novel.